Hello, I'm Stuart Preston, and this is the Stoned Ape Reports, where I have conversations with those who have changed their lives with the power of psychedelics. Quick announcement, you know about my one-man show, The Stoned Ape Show. Well, now there's a book titled The Grief Trip, How I Learned to Heal with Grief and Psychedelics. You can find it at www.thegrieftrip.com. 100% of proceeds go to the Ian Preston Memorial Fund to help support mental health and suicide prevention. So check it out. Okay, back to the podcast. In this episode, I had the honor of speaking with Sophia. Sophia was one of my first guests over a year ago. Back then, we discussed breaking away from a cult-like church with the aid of psychedelics, and she's back with an update. She discusses psychedelics as a gateway drug, a gateway to other healing modalities like yoga and therapy. She also talks about cognitive liberty and so much more. So let's hear from Sophia. So good to have you back again. We had a great conversation. I guess you reminded me it was maybe even over a year ago. Mm-hmm. So, we've stayed connected, but I'm really glad to have you back and to hear what's going on with you.
Definitely. Thank you for having me back. I think that it's funny when we were talking a little bit before it started to reflect on everything that's gone on in the last year and just how much change. So,
oh yeah.
Where to start. It's funny when I was kind of like looking back on some of my notes just over the last year and just thinking back about like our podcast interview last time. I was thinking a little bit about how even some of my perspectives about like psychedelics or like how I feel about using them has changed, not like in any dramatic way, but just I think my relationship to them has, I think, evolved, I would say. And I definitely feel like the biggest thing that I've been focusing on lately has really been integration.
Really? So, has there been other experiences that you've had that have had a transformation, or is really your focus on this whole process of integration, and what does integration mean to you?
Yeah, I think it's been a little bit of both. I don't know if you've ever talked to somebody who's, like a psychonaut or someone who's really interested in psychedelics that has had the experience of like saying that drugs have told them to stop doing drugs.
Yeah.
I definitely think that I've had experiences over the last year where I had opportunities to try different substances that I didn't necessarily have access to in the past. And also because of being quarantined, just the time and space to explore psychedelics more in a way that like I think personally is conducive. I think we were chit-chatting a little bit before about how as kind of like hermitist people, it can be a little bit of a relief to be locked down because it takes away, I don't know if this is how you feel, but for me, it's like it's taken away some of the social expectation that I think is sometimes always present, and people are a little bit more understanding about people needing time and space. We're living through a pandemic.
Yeah.
And so I think that during that time, being able to like explore things like DMT and also like more intense LSD trips, I felt at a point where I was like, wow, this is amazing and incredible. And these experiences are so much that I really need time to like actually sit with this.
Yeah.
So I think that.
Do you want to share one or two of those, and it's something that's gone on since then that there's been a big experience that has brought on some changes that you needed to integrate?
Yeah, I think that one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot, and that kind of ties back to our last conversation, is that, as I was raised in this really restrictive, I would call it, cult, I really had the biggest part of my experience with that was being separate from the world. And I think everybody right now with COVID can relate to the idea of like, oh, I'm feeling isolated or I'm feeling closed off, or, I think everyone with varying degrees of this, there is like the sense of isolation or solitude. And I think that it took me a long time of being quarantined and like working from home and being really strict about my contact with other people before I realized, wow, this is so similar to being in a cult, because as with my upbringing, I was like really not, one of the big things was like not allowed going to bars. I was like really, going to a place that only served alcohol would be a real big no-no. And like, that with COVID, that's a place that doesn't serve food. They're shut, they're shut down.
Wow, that's
Or
it. That's an interesting connection there.
yeah. And, once I made that connection, I was shocked that it took me that long to recognize that. But I was also homeschooled. And so that component of like being constantly home all the time, not really having a lot of options to go anywhere or do anything, because, when I was homeschooled, a lot of things that I wanted to do, as a kid were like considered quote unquote worldly, or they weren't allowed for whatever reason. So I just don't think that I made the mental connections right off the bat. I think that after I did in one of my trips, I kind of was like, I kind of felt like I couldn't unsee that. And I've been like working through that because it's really brought up a lot of things that I just kind of, I guess the best way to put it is I realized in not making that connection, I was also kind of not dealing with like a lot of childhood wounding and like not thinking about things that I hadn't thought about in a long time, like, the experiences of acute isolation and, deprivation from contact that comes from, being homeschooled and in a religious cult. So those were definitely the things that I think came up both in those trips and like processing those trips, and has like prompted me to be a little bit more tender with myself, and also kind of prompted the process of really wanting to integrate, what am I feeling, and can I be with what I'm feeling, and can I even deepen my experience with that to maybe widen my compassion for myself and other people. So I don't know if a lot of that would really make sense. And I definitely think we could potentially edit, if any of that was like a rambling, but.
No, that's good. That's good. Keep rambling.
It's
So
just
when you say
interesting.
integrate, what does integrate mean to you? Because I think as I talk to more and more people, my my idea of what integration means has really expanded. It used to be, and maybe I don't want to share too much. I'll let you talk, but yeah,
Oh
it
yeah,
just
no, I
has
would love to
grown. So
hear.
what does it mean to you when you integrate, one of these experiences?
Oh yeah, well, I definitely love hearing, what other people mean by that for sure, because I think it's one of those terms kind of like set and setting where everybody can have really such a wide definition. But I'd say for me, what that has really meant is taking what comes up, be it like emotions or thoughts, memories, maybe even ideas or concepts or dreams, like all the things that can be triggered or come up within the psychedelic sphere, that oftentimes come from our subconscious, things that we're really like ignoring or, blinding ourselves to, and like letting them be present in my life, and, working with them either in therapy, either in journaling and affirmations, especially I think coming from the background of like an evangelical religion that really demonizes anything to do with your body, or like, really not an embodied experience, not to offend anybody who has those belief systems. But I definitely think there's a lot of damage that comes from telling someone that you are sinful just inherently for your nature, just that's your true nature, and that's what your body represents. And so I think to that end, like recognizing that and doing things like yoga and other somatic therapies that really are embodied as kind of like the counter to that. And even, silly things like turning on music and like making sure that I dance and like enjoy myself. Like I think a bigger part of that that's come up is kind of the flip side of recognizing a lot of childhood wounding has been like really recognizing the importance of play, and like how I think that's actually something I'm glad that you encouraged me to ramble, because I thought about that mental connection to That's a big thing that I actually came to the conclusion of over the past years, that I have been doing so much hardcore like healing and working, and people say doing the work, and like those are really important things. Like self-examination is important. Self like I'm trying to think of what the right word is, but like self-accountability is
Mm-hmm.
important. But also like play is an essential part of healing. Having fun is an essential part of healing. Doing things recreationally is essential part of healing. I think having opportunities where I let myself have trips, psychedelic trips, where I was just like, I don't really have an intention besides enjoying myself, is actually kind of like a freeing thing as well. And like,
Yeah.
I a very integral and important part of, healing and integration.
So you've mentioned therapy and you've mentioned yoga. I mean, you're doing a lot of different things to help yourself and to grow and to find this joy and the physical part. Um, how important or what role would you say in your um, evolution and your growth would you say psychedelics have played overall?
Yeah, I think as an evangelical, it's something I worry about coming across as preachy about. But I think psychedelics probably have been one of the foremost most impactful, if not most important, aspects of that healing in my life. Like I feel like they have been kind of like a gate to these other practices and therapies that, I think I already had access to or awareness of, but didn't necessarily utilize or use in the same way that I have the relationship to them now. I think it's kind of like a thing that has helped things come together for me.
So it's not only like a gate that kind of I mean that implies like it opens up and gives you access to these things. But once you go through the gate and you do your therapy, because I have a therapist and she
Mhm.
watched my Stoned Ape show, and one of her first questions was, "Why are you talking to me?" Because I made a joke about how one trip can be like 2 to 4 years of therapy, and she was
Mhm.
like, "Well, why are you talking to me then?" Because there's value in all in therapy and in meditation and in yoga and talking and dancing and singing, and so just opening the gate to these things. But do you think that psychedelics also helped you really get the most from therapy and yoga and dancing and all these wonderful things?
Yeah, I do. And I think as a medical cannabis patient, I think that that's something that I feel like I still have an active relationship to psychedelics, even if I'm not using things like psilocybin or LSD or, other what are people classify like traditional psychedelics, because I think
Hmm.
I personally like, when you ask that, I immediately think that, marijuana is incredibly psychedelic. And so like that's just kind of part of my thought process with that. It's like an
Hmm.
active part of my life. And so also like something that I think kind of sometimes keeps that thread of like having a psychedelic container, which, I think could probably come across, could definitely sound a certain way that I don't know like how that could be interpreted. But I think that, psychedelics are both a gate, and then also I think in some way they kind of have held space in my life for these things is how I would express that.
Yeah.
And, I think that because I'm not like, if you would use the classification like of sobriety in between while integrating these things, I am also using cannabis, and I am also like using that as a psychological and physiological, medicine. And I do think that also helps me kind of like integrate and process the bigger, psychedelic
Hmm.
experiences.
Does it,
So
so how does it help you? So you have a great big psychedelic experience, and then weeks, months, whatever later, cannabis continues to help you integrate that experience. Is that what
yeah,
you're saying? And if so,
yeah,
how does that work? Why do you think
because
that is?
I think what you said about, maybe psychedelics opening the door to certain experiences and then still being able to, whether or not they like still guide me is what kind of made me think about that, because I don't think, regardless of whether I'm using, any plant medicine, be it cannabis, anything else, I always have carried with me like something that I think I can't ever shed after having done psychedelics. Like from the psychopharmacological perspective, psilocybin does cause permanent personality changes. This has been researched as far as like how it affects people's relationship to openness. And so I think just in that respect, I could like never go back to the person that I was prior to using psychedelics. But I also think that there are ways that people over-romanticize that. And, you can absolutely use mushrooms and then go back to your daily life and never make any changes either. That's, that's an aspect of it. So it's also like interesting to kind of reconcile the ways that it stays with you, but then doesn't, I think that's where the agency of integration and choice kind of comes in. And I think that, oftentimes when I'm doing practices like, say, yoga, for example, I experience a lot of chronic pain and a lot of like physical difficulties. And so if I were doing yoga, and I were really trying to be with my body and with the experience of it, and also like pushing myself a little bit, there could be situations where that's like actually really triggering. There's like a lot of conversations like within clinicians about how mindfulness really isn't always the most helpful piece of the puzzle if people have, conditions like complex PTSD or PTSD, because sometimes being in your body is really uncomfortable. But I think that having access to like medical marijuana, for example, to like broadly answer your question, is where, I can kind of like take those pieces of the puzzle that might have been somewhat unlocked or like open to me because of my psychedelics use. And then like, I know like having cannabis enhanced yoga, then I can have that experience of like being with my body and being a little bit more comfortable and feeling physically better because, it's like a medicine. And I think kind of also like allowing a little bit of a sense of deeper awareness and like general, connection to my physicality without it being so uncomfortable in a way that, I think a lot of trauma survivors can probably relate to like not feeling comfortable being with your body. But at the same time,
definitely.
I'm saying all this and like, I think the one thing that I wanted to get back to and at least emphasize that I said at the get-go was about, drugs telling you not to do drugs. As much as I do think that cannabis has been incredibly helpful and incredibly medicinal, I also have had points over the past year where I really also like wanted to examine my relationship to that. And, whether or not it was something that was beneficial or whether or not it was being an escape. So it's
what
like
did you
very
discover?
but it's hard to answer that question. That it's very difficult to say how do you work with these medicines in a way that feels good. Both your, I guess if you want to say your conscience or maybe whatever is guiding you as far as what feels right for your frequency of use, and then also navigating the over-cultural stigmas that come from all of this, because I definitely feel a trepidation in discussing cannabis and discussing like being a daily cannabis user. And that's something that I think just probably has like so much stigma around, and that it has to be a part of the equation. And then also, I think, it's important, like going back to that discussion of like self-accountability, for me to be able to say like, oh yeah, over the course of COVID, I have absolutely engaged in using cannabis in a way that was not so medicinal and was definitely more escapist. So maybe the best and simplest way to say is that I think in all things, I've really learned that like checking in with myself and examining my intentions, and then like really like having an awareness of that. And then if my intentions are maybe not aligned with what I think is within my best, growth, or to like use your, the term evolution, then maybe to reassess that and making that a process. I think that, maybe I could say that's what I would consider integration.
Is going back and doing that examination.
Yeah.
Understanding what the relationship was, doing that self-accountability. So not just, oh, cool, I had this great vision that could change my life, but it's also like, okay, what does this whole process mean within my own growth and my own healing?
Yeah, definitely.
Now you mentioned the stigma here. Have you dealt with stigmas? How open are you about this, and what kind of pushback have you gotten? What kind of acceptance have you gotten? Kind of what's your experience around the stigma around psychedelics and cannabis?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because I think it's one of those things that varies so much just depending on who you are talking to and the circumstances. And I definitely find that, in my efforts to like really want to be open about my experiences and talk freely about them, I also want to like be careful from the perspective of knowing that these substances are, not only widely stigmatized, but also widely illegal. So it's a really careful and delicate balance. And the one thing that I also personally find I struggle with is like, because of the background of people pleasing and shape shifting, I don't know, the scripture, I couldn't quote it exactly, but about being all things to all people was something that really, I really had to unlearn. And I think I'm still unlearning. And so I find that when I initially started using psychedelics, it was really hard for me to talk to somebody about them openly if I didn't think that they were going to be receptive.
Yeah.
But like we were kind of like chit-chatting about before the start of the show, oftentimes when you start talking about stuff with folks, you'll find that, your expectations can be subverted. And oftentimes people have much more similar experiences than, you would think. And I think that when it comes to stigma, I don't doubt that a good deal of that really is kind of like more the overculture and more the legality aspect of it than any real pushback.
Yeah.
Because I think I've had some overwhelmingly positive experiences. I love that you've talked to me about talking to a counselor about psychedelics. Like, I've always been upfront with my counselor about my use of psychedelics and that, I needed the space and therapy to process those experiences. And so, my counselor has always kind of been like very neutral and very much like, I don't know a lot about these substances, but I trust you to make your own decisions. And, I think there have been times when she's asked me to examine, like, she said, hey, can you consider if you feel like maybe a lot of triggering is coming up after like a psychedelic trip, or, you're finding yourself a little bit dysregulated, or, she'll notice those patterns. Or maybe like, I was talking about like feeling like there have been times when cannabis was really escapist, she's brought to my attention like questions, just different things. And I think I appreciate that perspective just for some grounding. And I don't think I've had too much, that's probably the most unfavorable, and that's really, really neutral. But that being said, like, I haven't necessarily talked with my parents about these substances, although, I should redact that. I initially did not want to talk to my parents about these substances. When we had our interview last year, I was really nervous about whether or not I wanted them to listen to it. I felt like you asked me, is how key do I feel like these things are? And I think they're a big part of my life. And so it felt like I was really hiding a part of myself. So I've been slowly kind of trying to talk a little bit more without necessarily scaring them off, because,
Mm-hmm.
I have a sibling who's underage that I have contact with, and then I really wouldn't want to have a problem with that. Um,
Yeah.
but, over the last year, my parents both had a lot of health problems, which was really scary and stressful. And the one thing that came from that was an opportunity to say, hey, you guys know, I'm a medical marijuana patient. And, if you're dealing with this kind of pain, I want you to consider seeing a doctor that can prescribe you cannabis. Know that that's an option for you legally. And that was actually a really good conversation. And
Hmm.
I felt good about the fact that, I just was able to frame it like that. And also to tell them, because, it's one of the things I think you kind of likened that to coming out of the closet. It definitely was a stressful feeling of how are they going to take this? How is this going to be received?
Yeah. Yeah. It's scary, isn't it?
Yeah. But
Well, especially with everything you've been through, you know what I mean? It's the fear of breaking out of that church, or the cult. And in this, you've gone through a few of these doors.
yeah. And that's actually very validating to hear, because it does remind me that oftentimes, there's still so much fear that remains. And I think that it's funny you mentioned your therapist had asked you, why do you still go see her if you've worked through all these things with psychedelics? And I think that that's one of the things that keeps me both, working with psychedelic medicines and also working on myself, just introspectively, or working through my past, because I know that just as much as we move through those doors, those initiations of loss and grief, you still move through that in life.
Mm-hmm.
It's unfortunately nothing is guaranteed. I have some of these fears are really unfounded, because they're, rooting in the trauma of not only losing people from being shunned, but also, I was raised to shun people. So it's this conditional relationship where you expect people to, drop you at any moment. But
Yeah.
I also have been really living with death and impermanence. And so those fears are valid because they're
Yes.
never ending. I think, we're never going to kind of stop getting hit with the stuff that is our lives. And so therefore, we're never going to stop needing to find a way to work through it and be with it.
Yeah, exactly. So what you normally ask people, what do they recommend? Somebody who's listening, what would you recommend in terms of how to approach psychedelics and how to have a healthy um, experience without harm, but I also kind of want to ask you, and I don't know if you want to share it, feel free to say no.
Mhm.
Somebody out there who's stuck in a cult or a culty church, how do they get out of it? I mean, how do you because so many of them we see on TV that, it's like, okay, you can leave because you're not, under arrest, but we're never going to talk to you again, and you just lost your entire family. Right? I mean,
Yeah.
how the fear of breaking away from this structured environment. What do you want to share anything about that? Do you want to say well, kind of here's the first step you got to do, or is there an underground railroad for people that want to get out?
There kind of is. It's funny that you mentioned the Underground Railroad. I would have to email you back after I check on, whether or not this is still up and running.
Yeah,
But when
yeah,
I was reading the XJW Discord, which I guess I don't mind naming, you can keep that. The one thing that I was working with was it was a joint effort between ex-Jehovah's Witnesses and ex-Mormons, to create a digital space where we could kind of connect people who were trying to leave oppressive religious structures with help, actual physical, help or resources, either online or in person.
yeah.
And so that's something that I know exists, but I also would because I haven't been actively working directly with I've been working like broader sense with ex-religious communities and not such niche. I really have to check on that. But I think the first thing that I would say for someone to do is to get online. I think that the ability, like the access to the internet, is probably one of the greatest tools that anybody who's needing help with critical thinking has at this day and age. And unfortunately, also probably in so many ways, so antithetical to critical thinking. But, I think talking to people and reading and pushing that initial bubble of like going and ingesting information that is potentially going to speak against your group is the hardest thing and the biggest step for anybody. Because I think for any high control organization, the biggest thing that is really drilled in is like othering and us versus them mentality. And there's the International Cultic Studies Association, so ISDA, also has some really good resources, as well as the BITE model, which is BITE. I think for anybody, if anybody were to think to themselves, like, maybe, is the organization I grew up with a cult? If you've ever had that question, if you've ever asked yourself if I'm a cult, that is a really good sign.
Yeah.
I had that question as growing up. I had that question as an adult. And I think that seeing things like the BITE model, where David Hassan and other psychologists have really outlaid in pretty general terms these very common models that high control organizations follow, it's really helpful. And, I think that kind of groupthink can unfortunately even go beyond just religion, and people can find themselves enmeshed in all sorts of things. Like, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, but like whatever was kind of marketed as like a self-improvement type of thing. I think a lot of things like multi-level marketing even can function in very much the same way. So
yes, yeah, there's a whole family tree of those organizations now. I mean, I have friends that are part of these things, and I'll say, oh, look at this, I'm going to go to this event, and my wife's like, do you know where that comes from? And will give me the whole hierarchy, and then you're kind of like, holy crap, I had no idea that this was kind of what you might call a high control organization.
Yeah. So I think anything like just learning, being curious, I think for anybody, regardless of what your relationship to something like this is, just being willing to be curious is probably, that's probably anybody's first step in like what I would call cognitive liberty. And I think that relates to getting started with psychedelics as well. And I use that term a lot, like cognitive liberty, when it relates to people's rights to use psychedelics or otherwise augment their consciousness. And I think that usually starts with being curious.
Yeah.
Asking questions.
Excellent. So I guess my last question, then I'll just open it up for whatever you want to talk about, if you have anything, is, so now that was great advice for somebody who may have asked that key question, is this a cult? And what they can do to move forward. Somebody out there who's listening to this that's also thinking about maybe exploring psychedelics, I guess I always have to put the caveat. Sophia and I are not telling you to do psychedelics. We're not recommending it. It's not for everybody. Make sure that you have the right mental history, the mental health history in your family and in your own life. And it's an illegal drug, so don't do it illegally. Find a legal place to do it. But all that said, if somebody out there is thinking about doing this, what do you think the keys are to do it in a good, positive, healthy way? And that doesn't mean like a good trip with rainbows and butterflies, right? I mean, it may be horrible, right, and you get something great out of it. So we're not saying like a good trip versus a bad trip, but overall at the end of it, you come out with some good lessons that you can integrate into your life. What do you think the keys are for somebody looking to do this to make sure they do it in a safe and productive way?
Yeah. And I love that you did mention, what the distinction for a good trip can really be, because that's definitely something that there's a lot of misconceptions about, I think. I think, as time worn as the term is, having a good set and setting and really understanding, what that means and also what that means to you is probably one of the most crucial things, as well as, we talked a lot about the concept of integration, but I think that one thing that really is a big key for particularly first-time psychedelic users would be for them to have support. So much of like what you'll see and run across when people have an intense experience is not really knowing how to process it or knowing where to go with it. And I think being proactive and giving yourself both information and potential community for whatever comes up is really, really important. And, no shame for anybody that doesn't think about that ahead of time. God knows, for listen to my first episode, there's things that came up on my trips I would have never expected and didn't have, any kind of support for. And that can't be helped. There are things you can't anticipate. But I really think that asking yourself, what's my current mindset? How do I feel? What are my intentions? What do I want to get out of this? I think those are really good questions to ask. And then also asking yourself, what does my actual setting that I'm doing this in look like? Even simple things like cleaning your house beforehand is like a big thing that I tell people, or having water accessible, like making things dead simple on yourself. And, going back to the curiosity component, I think doing your research can be really helpful, especially from the psychopharmacological aspect of it. This past year, I used a substance called Changa. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that at all.
No.
It's basically it's DMT that has been altered in such a way so that it's a free-based DMT, so the crystal DMT that's been altered so that it can be smoked and have a longer onset and a longer trip, rather than like the typical free-based DMT would have an immediate onset and like a 10 to 15 minute trip. This allows you to like redose and take it steadily and then have like more potential for a breakthrough. Some people call it like smokable ayahuasca, but really all it is that it's free-based DMT that's been mixed with plants containing an MAOI, and then covered in alcohol and then let to solve. I can't remember all of the chemistry of it. At any rate,
that's okay.
That's kind of, I bring it up because there's potential interactions that are not present with DMT freebase. And so there's just things that are, maybe if you're not thinking about it, really wouldn't have been a problem, but because it contains an MAOI, it's a problem if anybody is taking an MAOI inhibitor. It could actually have some really serious contradictions. And so I, thankfully I knew that, and I also wasn't taking any contradictory substances, but it was something that when I researched it ahead of time and learned about it, it was a little sobering to be reminded of, because oftentimes as someone who's primarily used really only like plant-based entheogenic things, I don't really think typically about this topic of harm as much in the physical sense. I definitely think about psychological harm reduction. But from that perspective,
what was that substance called again? Changa or something?
Changa, yeah, CHANGA.
All right. So you think more in terms of the mental aspect, the pharmacological aspect. Yeah, that makes sense. Because I've learned something about, harm reduction in like groups, and ceremonies, to make sure there's things like first aid kits available and all that. But I think you've given a pretty good background there. So I feel like I cut you off there trying to get the name of Changa. What else did you want to say about the setting and preparation and all that stuff? Anything else?
No, I wish that I could find, there was like a really good breakdown that I had found in the book Cosmic Trooper by Robert and Don Wilson, of really like defining set and setting, but I couldn't find it now to kind of reiterate it. But
that's okay. We can point people to the book. What was that book again?
Yeah, I actually, it's my perennial recommendation now. It's called Cosmic Trigger by Robert Anton Wilson. And honestly, I think it's one of my favorite books of all time, and really a fun read for anybody, especially psychonauts. I think he introduces the concept of the chapel perilous, kind of like being in a place where you're not sure whether or not you're having delusions or you're really having some real shit.
Yeah.
And it's a really fun read.
Interesting. Yeah, I'd never heard of it, so thank you for that. I will definitely put a link to that in
There's a lot
the
of
text.
information from Timothy Leary, and so he specifically like goes over Timothy Leary's sentence setting process from when he was like doing actual clinical trials at Harvard, because it was written in like 1971 or so. So that's a cool fun part about that. But yeah, I definitely just would say to that note to encourage anybody, especially if they don't have access to a ceremony where they're going to have first aid. But also that's, it's good to remind people that to vet the people that you're doing ceremonies with. I think especially because I've never engaged with any of that, never had the privilege that I think especially when people have to unfortunately do things underground, it of course leads to more harm taking place. And so I'm glad that you mentioned the concept of harm reduction, to just kind of reiterate to everybody to not only check, your substances, but also if you can to test them.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh yeah. Testing is paramount. Okay. That's great advice. So what else? What else have we not talked about? Anything else you want to share with us?
I'm trying to think of anything else. I think it's been an incredible year and I could probably talk about so much, but I think we've covered a lot of good stuff, and hopefully I haven't rambled too much.
No, you haven't rambled at all. Yeah, but was there anything about the year you want to get out there, or do you think you got it covered?
I just think that I'm looking forward to giving everybody in my life that I really care about a big hug, and everybody that I don't even care that much about a big hug,
Yes.
I think I have really considered the importance of human connection and making time for other people. I definitely always struggled with being an ambivert. Like, I'm very extroverted. I love people dearly. I love connecting with them. And I also love having time alone. And it's hard to balance that. But, I really recognize we are very social animals, and more than anything, we need each other and are connected in ways that are pretty incomprehensible.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, there's much to be said for skin to skin interaction and hugs and, being there and trading chemicals and all that good stuff. So yeah, one day it'd be nice to get back to that. I got my first shot, so, could be getting close. Yeah.
Well, soon your only issue is just going to be, I don't know if you've heard, FOMO, fear of missing out.
Yeah.
Now the FOGO, fear of going out. So you're going to be just in the opposite boat soon. That's a concern of mine. I think once I get vaccinated, I'm like really apprehensive to reintegrate to whatever real life looks like. So we'll see what that journey.
Yeah. It can be like coming out of the shelter after a apocalyptic event. You're kind of like looking around like, is it safe to come out here? Yeah, I get it. Well, Sophia, thank you so much for coming back. Really learned a lot from you every time I talk to you, and you're like one of my teachers, in real life. I always learn from you because you'll call people out on stuff and ask interesting questions. So
well, I love that, and I love hearing your perspective. I just want to throw this out there that I love hearing from folks that have different perspectives than me, especially people that are older, that especially older, and you have changed a lot as you've gotten older. I think that that's something that is probably really uniquely hard, and I have a lot of admiration for it as well. And so I think
it's good to have people like you to help, because I grew up with a lot of prejudices and a lot of biases, and psychedelics will kind of give a Fred Flintstone club to that. But when you have somebody who is like you, that doesn't have all that, kind of call you out and go, hey, you probably shouldn't put it that way, or have you thought about this, or have you thought about that? So you've been a real teacher, and I appreciate that.
Well, thank you. It was really good catching up with you as always.
That concludes this edition of the Stoned Ape Reports. Thank you for listening. Please follow us on Instagram at Stoned Ape Comedy and subscribe to our newsletter at www.stonedapecomedy.com. Again, thanks for listening and catch you next time, Stoned Apes.